Belarus and Russia have announced a week-long training program for officers in charge of their joint military grouping in Belarus. Moscow's troops invaded Ukraine across the Belarusian border last February. Ukraine says that the threat of a renewed Russian offensive there is currently low, but they are doing everything they can to make sure that it stays that way. As our correspondent, Max Zander, reports.
Somewhere close to the Belarusian border, under the cover of pine trees, Ukrainian border guards are reinforcing their positions.
These trenches are designed to protect the lives of the people in the military, as well as to provide defense. So if the enemy attacks from the nearest road, our infantry will respond.
He won't go into detail about their preparations and won't even confirm that these trenches are new, but you can smell sawdust and the boards seem dry and clean. In the distance, we hear trees being felled. Their message is, Russians won't get past them a second time. This bridge used to join Ukraine and Belarus. The defenders blew it up to try to stop the first Russian advance. Now they are looking across the river again. Right now, the situation here seems calm, but soldiers here are prepared for this to change at any moment. The worries are that the Russians could push through here again in a second attempt to take Kyiv, with freshly mobilized troops and lessons that they learned from last time. It's places like these that the Russians moved through before. The settlements south of the border, where the fighting was fierce and lives changed forever. Alexander lived here with his wife, mother, and stepfather. He wants to show us the damage to his property.
The regular citizens were shelled with mortars. The Russian artillery was firing at the farm, and our tanks fired back at them. The artillery and tank shells didn't hit our house, but the mortars did.
A wall came down on his mother.
This is where my mother's grave was.
Alexander buried her here in his garden. Only after the Russians retreated could he move her to a cemetery. And yet, Alexander doesn't want to leave.
I believe that people have experienced such horror that it is difficult for me to add anything. You have to live. We want to live. And panic? There's no sense in panicking. Where to run? We have nowhere to run to. We'll see what happens.
Most of those who are still here feel like him. Further down the road, Irina runs a shop. Her house was also damaged in the fighting.
I don't even know. I don't want to go anywhere, and at the moment we're not able to. It's very scary for children, and I'm very worried.
Everyone we met here can talk about pain and loss, but it seems courage and determination run just as deep.
Well, Belarus's authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, meanwhile, is Moscow's closest ally in Europe. While he's repeatedly denied that he is taking orders from Putin, the increasing collaboration between the two different countries tells a different story.
In the early days of the war, a bird's-eye view of this road towards Kyiv caused shock and fear in Ukraine and beyond. Satellite images revealed a 64-kilometer-long convoy of Russian tanks headed towards the Ukrainian capital from the north. As part of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, Russian troops entered the country from Belarusian territory in February 2022. A ground assault on Kyiv was thwarted, but the offensive showed that Moscow could count on its ally in Minsk.
If someone is thinking about driving a wedge between us, it will not happen.
To many, it was no surprise. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko is politically isolated in Europe and heavily reliant on the Kremlin. In October, the two countries announced a joint force of Russian and Belarusian military units stationed in Belarus. And early January saw Lukashenko pay a visit to Russian soldiers there. Both Putin and Lukashenko have looked to display unity, but that doesn't mean that the two are in lockstep, according to exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya.
Putin also knows that Belarusian people are against Lukashenko, and this possible participation of Belarusian troops could raise unpredictable consequences. I doubt that a possible attack can take place like on land, but missiles can be launched from Belarusian territory at any moment.
Hard evidence of a planned Russian invasion from Belarus is also sparse.
Get right to your questions. We do know that Russian forces have conducted exercises with Belarus forces, but at this time, no indication of any type of offensive action that looks imminent. But again, we'll continue to closely monitor.
Belarus says joint drills with Russia are for defense purposes only. But pictures like these haven't allayed fears that Moscow is planning a repeat of last year's assault on Kyiv.
And Katia Glod studies the relationship between Belarus, Russia, and the West as part of the European Leadership Network and the Center for European Policy Analysis. I asked her earlier whether she thinks Russia is preparing a fresh attack on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
Well, most military experts think that the attack from Russia is quite likely this year, but we don't know whether it will be from Belarus. And to be honest, the military exercises in Belarus don't really tell us that the attack is going to happen from Belarus or it is indeed imminent. The most significant signal here is that we are not seeing really sufficient number of Russian troops. In fact, the number of Russian troops has decreased. A few months ago, there were about 10,000, 11,000. Now, half at least of those troops have already been sent to Donbas, and we have around 5,000 Russian troops in Belarus. So we are really seeing more that the military equipment and the soldiers are being sent further away from Belarus. That, of course, does not mean that the situation will not change, but at the moment there are no signs that there is any deployment of troops or any deployment of joint commands being built in Belarus.
Why do you think that is? You mentioned that there were fewer troops in Belarus. Is that just because Russian forces are stretched thin at the moment?
Well, yes, they're stretched thin, and also because Belarus has been more more effective for being as a very good, safe logistical rear support to the Russian war in Ukraine. We have seen that Belarus has been used as a launch pad. Ammunitions have been sent, about 65,000 from September to March last year. That's the figures we have. Belarus really has been more useful in this sense because the troops that Belarus possesses, they're small in size, and another thing to remember that they're very low in morale. They're not reliable. They may desert. Only 18% of the Belarusian public think that if Belarusian troops were sent to fight to Ukraine, they would fight. Most people think that they would desert, they would try to fight on the Ukrainian side, but they will not participate in this war.
Okay, so, when we look at the situation also more broadly, Belarus itself was shaken by, of course, widespread protests in 2020, and there's a very active exile movement against its ruler, Alexander Lukashenko. How secure do you think his hold is on power, and how dependent is he on Russia, on Putin?
Yes, his hold is pretty secure now. He still has very small support compared to the support that the opposition enjoys in Belarusian society. However, there are some people there, minority, obvious minority in Belarus, who think that it's thanks to Lukashenko that Belarus has not been dragged into this war. At the same time, people are very frustrated with the war because over 80% of the Belarusian public, unlike in Russia, do not see this war as justified, and they do not want to see Russian troops stationed on the Belarusian soil. So from that perspective, people are against the regime. However, the regime is still very strong. It's got obviously, as you mentioned, it's got, first of all, Russian support, political, military, and economic support. And economic support has been very important. We have seen that despite the sanctions that have been imposed by the West on Belarus, Belarus has been able to redirect most of its trade flows to Russia. Now, about 40% of the, for example, trade between Belarus and the European Union has been taken over to Russia. So Russia is really a very safe harbor to Belarus. And we have seen that the relations between two leaders have been recently quite good. We have not really seen that Putin is pushing Lukashenko into sending troops. On the contrary, Russia has provided cheap price for the gas for Belarus, a lower price for oil. It has given Belarus more investments in terms of helping to build joint military equipment. So it's been quite good for Lukashenko, but his support is still there.
Katia Glod, fellow at the European Leadership Network. Thank you. Lukashenko has ruled Belarus with an iron grip for almost 3 decades. The last election was held in 2020. And it was followed by mass protest over the results. The dissent was soon crushed, leading to thousands of Belarusians fleeing the country. Many of them ended up in Ukraine, where they now have to contend with Russia's war. DW's Sonia Falnikar reports from Kyiv.
Glory to Ukraine. Long live Belarus. Dissidents and even fighters in the Ukrainian army commemorate fellow Belarusians who have died fighting for Kyiv. Organizers say it's the first rally by Belarusian exiles in Ukraine since Russia's invasion. Just months earlier, Ales Minau had fled to Ukraine to avoid prison for his activism. He said a warm welcome turned frosty after Moscow used Belarusian territory to launch its invasion.
The attitude has changed, but I get it. The Ukrainian Security Service came to my place. They checked the apartment, my phone, and we had a talk. But it was polite. In Belarus, people come in masks and with weapons, and that's the end.
Here, Ales says he can work freely, but he's working alone and on a shoestring. He says fears that Belarus might again help Russia attack make people here wary of him. It's a feeling familiar to Irina, another young Belarusian who fled to Ukraine. They both miss home, but are starting to feel settled here.
At the beginning of the war, I was really scared, especially because of my last name, which is Lukashenko. I was scared to even say it or to show my documents, to say that I'm from Belarus. I don't know what's worse, when there's a war and missiles can rain down on you, or someone can come to your home at any moment and send you to jail.
Irina says she's applied for asylum in Ukraine, but as a Belarusian, still can't open a bank account. Here, she's volunteering for the war effort and is determined to stay.
I'm inspired by Ukraine, how they're organizing, how they're volunteering, how they're working together. I would love to see the same thing in Belarus.
At the rally, Ales says even as a reporter, he has to take a stance.
When I came here, I asked myself, should I take the Belarusian flag with me? I decided yes. Journalistic ethics don't allow it. But on the other hand, it's a time when even journalists should take a position, show which side they're on. This is our common war against our common enemy.